Friends, we will now experience historic moments in the development of our faith through a dramatic vignette. 4 American Baha'is who met the beloved Master Abdu'l-Baha in 1912 will open their hearts to you. Each one will reveal how she or he came to a personal understanding of the power of the covenant, and how that understanding arose out of obedience. Obedience to the center of the covenant, Abdu'l-Baha. Let us now go back to 1912. We're in the city of the covenant and meet Juliet Thompson, Lua Getzinger, Howard McNutt, and yes, Louis Gregory.
When I was 10 years old, I began to dream of someday painting a portrait of Jesus Christ. I think I always knew I would paint, even before that time. But when I was 10, I remember we were living with my grandparents. My father had just died and my mother had no money. It was then that this very presumptuous idea took hold of me. I became determined to paint Jesus. I even prayed that I might. Oh God, I prayed. You know Christ didn't look the way all the pictures of him look. Please let me paint him when I grow up as the King of men. And I never lost hope of this. All through art school, until I met the Master. When I saw Abdu'l-Baha, then I knew no one could paint the Christ. It was on pilgrimage in Akka when I began my diary. Oh, Akka, white-walled city by the sea where I dedicated my heart to Abdu'l-Baha. But like my diary, my dedication was also a lifelong effort. When you return to America, Juliet, the Master said, I want you to do your best to bring about unity. You're going back to New York to serve me. But how could I unify the Friends when my own heart was divided? You see, I was in love with the Reverend Dr. Percy Grant. His Church of the Ascension was just a half block from my studio. For years I would go there to hear him preach. Admiration soon became something more. I fell in love. I've only had one strong love in my life, and that was Percy, the charismatic rector who not only championed social justice, but preached world brotherhood as well. What better partner could be found for me? But in Akka, Abdu'l-Baha said I might have to break with Percy. Either you must marry him, he said, or separate yourself from him. Cut yourself entirely from him. Why was this asked of me? Maybe I was more anxious to lead Percy Grant to the kingdom than to go there myself. Maybe I counted on romantic union with Percy more than eternal union with God. After all, I did miss spending an extra day with Abdu'l-Baha because of my haste to get back to New York. And to Percy, oh, the Master knew my heart so well. Can you transfer this love to God, he asked. That was the question, could I? There are degrees of love, the Master said, And then he explained he carried a measuring rod in his hand by which he measured the love of the friends. And that rod was obedience. All that winter I refused to see Percy. My heart was still attached to him, but I felt somehow in refusing to see him I was at least in part obeying the master. Then a note arrived from Percy. It was an invitation. He wanted Abdu'l-Baha's first public address in New York to be at the church where he himself was minister. If half-hearted obedience brings forth such fruit, I thought, what will full obedience bring forth? Oh, on that day at the Church of the Ascension, Percy arranged everything with the touch of an artist, everything choreographed so perfectly. First the procession with flowers and music. Then Percy addressed the congregation. He read a prophecy from the Old Testament pointing directly to the promised day, to Baha'u'llah. Then on cue, the choir burst into a chorus of Jesus Lives Again, and Percy introduced the Master. I sat there, happier it seemed to me than I had been in my entire life. I was in the presence of my Lord, and the one I loved best in all this human world had at last recognized him. Maybe all my suffering had been for this reconciliation. For what else could that exquisite service have meant, with its theme of resurrection stressed throughout, so bold and daring a proclamation in the very church itself? It never occurred to me to think it might really have meant something else. After the service, I waited joyously in the rectory for Percy. At last he rushed in, his cheeks flushed. "My darling," he said, "my darling." "You made everything so beautiful," I told him. "I can't find the right words to thank you." But then something in his look, something false, awakened me. "Julie," he said, "my darling, I did it all for you." And then I realized he had staged a performance. He had used the Master as a pawn to woo me, manipulating the cause for his own purposes. I saw then, with complete clarity, how right Abdu'l-Baha had been. Horrified, sick at heart, I turned away. Thank God I had obeyed.
My grandmother was entirely of African blood. She was a slave in South Carolina. Her white master kept her as mistress and made her pregnant with my mother. After my mother was born, she too became a slave on her white father's plantation. After the Civil War, my grandmother and mother were freed. The most common response to oppression is to hate or to stay put in one's place. But my grandmother's response was to raise a grandson who could not be intimidated. She was illiterate, but she schooled me in dignity and courage. She taught me that whites were not just the oppressor, but also my playmates, my school teachers, and my grandfather. She taught me the truth, the whole truth, that my people had suffered and continue to suffer from prejudice and injustice. But whites were my people too. But a young man gets angry when he sees hundreds of lynchings every year. White mobs would destroy Negro property and nothing would be done. My grandmother had saved my heart from bitterness for the white man, but she could not save my mind from suspicion from him. I began outlining strategies for black action. I was influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois and his cry for civil rights. Religion held no interest for me at this point. I had been seeking but not finding the truth, and so had given up. But when I met Abdu'l-Baha, my vision changed. The shining reality of the Master, the personification of all Baha'i ideals, beckoned to me, and I became a confirmed believer. Abdu'l-Baha expressed the hope that I would become the means whereby the white and black people would close their eyes to racial differences. I took his words to heart and obeyed them as command. I abandoned my profession as a lawyer and became a racial amity worker. The majority of my friends thought that I had become mentally deranged, unbalanced. A leading Washington newspaper gave me 2 columns of ridicule for becoming a Baha'i. But all this I could bear. What pained me more was the fact that the Baha'is were still holding segregated meetings. Washington, D.C. was a thoroughly segregated society. Even the churches were segregated. But if this was a new religion dedicated to unity, why were its believers divided? Baha'u'llah's writings said this was wrong. Why did the Baha'is not meet all together in one place? Are the Baha'is full of prejudice like other people? Abdu'l-Baha again came to my rescue. He insisted that the Baha'is hold integrated meetings. But Abdu'l-Baha did not stop with the Baha'is. While he was in Washington, a formal luncheon was planned in his honor at the Persian embassy. Alexander Perry, the North Pole explorer, and Alexander Graham Bell were just 2 of the prominent people in attendance. Now, place cards have been set out next to all the plates in order to seat people according to strict Washington protocol. But at the last moment, just as the guests were about to be seated, Abdu'l-Baha gathered up all the cards. He shuffled them and then redistributed them around the table. He then took me by the hand and led me to the head of the table, to the place of honor. And this at an almost all-white luncheon. I had been taken to new heights by the Master. With one light and loving gesture, Abdu'l-Baha pointed out the foolishness of prejudice and segregation both. Abdu'l-Baha urged me to become the means whereby the white and black people would close their eyes to racial difference. He told me not to look upon my limited capacity, but upon the bounties of the Lord. He also introduced me to Miss Louisa Matthew, a Baha'i from London, a white woman. Abdu'l-Baha mentioned in our presence that interracial marriage was a good way to end racial prejudice. I remembered the words of my grandmother. The whites are not just your oppressors. They're also your playmates, your teachers, and your grandfather. On September the 27th, 1912, in New York City, the city of the covenant, I was married to Louisa Matthew. We were middle-aged, mature persons. We were quite fond of each other and respected each other. But our union was the work of Abdu'l-Baha. Our love for the Master gave us both the courage to confront the social prejudice of those days. In 38 states of the Union, it was illegal for a black and white couple to travel together. Our marriage was difficult, but it was a happy one. How could it not be? Because it was Abdu'l-Baha that brought us together.
The week I witnessed the Master lead Louis Gregory to the head of the table was the week this painting came into existence. I was visiting with Edna when Abdu'l-Baha suddenly entered the room. "I'm going out for a drive," he said, "but wait till I return, Edna, and you too, Juliet, wait. I will see you in a short time." So I waited and waited. 6:30 came, Then 7 o'clock. We were due at the Elkins at 7:30, and their house was a long way off, rather indirect on the bus line. Go, Juliet, Edna urged. I'll explain. But how could I leave? My lord had told me to stay. So I waited. It was a little after 7 o'clock when Abdu'l-Baha came back from his drive. When he entered the room where he had left me, and where, of course, I was still waiting, he said, "Ah, Juliet, for your sake I returned. Mrs. Hemmick wanted to keep me, but I had asked you to wait. Therefore, I returned." After a pause, he added, "Would you like to come up tomorrow and paint me?" So I learned once again the reward of obedience. Such a reward for such a small act of obedience. My childhood dream was about to be fulfilled at last. Once in Haifa, the master said to me, "Keep my words, obey my commands, and you will marvel at the results." And by a miracle, I wasn't late for dinner. The dinner at the Elkins had been postponed by half an hour.
In the early days of the faith in New York, we were confused about the station of Abdu'l-Baha. Arthur Dodge, the designer of the Dodge motor car, who also established the first Baha'i spiritual assembly in New York, Arthur Dodge was one of a number of Baha'is who taught that the Master was the return of Christ. Dodge. He also ridiculed me for allowing an Eastern Swami to live in my house. I'm afraid we were often at odds. In fact, we rarely attended a spiritual assembly meeting when we knew the other was going to be there. For I knew that the Master was not a manifestation of God, not the return of Christ. He is a man, a very great man of as great a station as St. Peter, but in spirit no different from other men. I knew that we too could attain to the station of the Master if only we would obey Baha'u'llah's teachings. You can see how wrong I was. For in teaching that Abdu'l-Baha was like St. Peter, I implied that the Master could make mistakes. The way Peter 3 times denied Christ, and the center of the covenant cannot err. That is the whole significance and safeguard of the covenant. Nonetheless, I taught this notion in all the Baha'i communities to which I traveled, and in 1 year I managed to travel 25,000 miles to 100 communities. But my teaching that Abdu'l-Baha was like St. Peter caused confusion in the Baha'i meetings. And finally, the Baha'is stopped inviting me to speak. In Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Baltimore, I was no longer welcome. Some of the Baha'is even refused to associate with me. I was shunned. Then, a special election was held to remove me from the New York Spiritual Assembly. I was cast aside. I felt discarded, thrown away. All my services became ashes in my mouth. Then, Abdu'l-Baha came to New York to educate us as to his station as the center of the covenant. When he arrived, he treated me like a son. He allowed me to meet his ship and to escort him back to his hotel. He permitted my wife and me to make a short motion picture of him at my Brooklyn home. He also consented to my request to record his blessed voice chanting a prayer. Then my test came. There were covenant breakers in Chicago, followers of Khairullah. Abdu'l-Baha, the center of the covenant, dispatched me to Chicago to warn and reprimand them. I was also instructed to sever my relationship with Khairullah. This was very difficult for me. Khairullah had taught me the faith. He was my spiritual father. Well, I arrived in Chicago and I met with the covenant breakers. But I did nothing about the diseased situation. Worse, I even wired back to the master that I had found them all to be angels.
Howard MacNutt had just returned to New York. I was standing with Abdu'l-Baha on the second floor of the Kinney's home when Howard arrived. The master immediately took him into another room. Meanwhile, a large crowd was gathering downstairs, anticipating a talk by Abdu'l-Baha. Finally, the master emerged with Howard. Howard looked wilted. I heard Abdu'l-Baha say to him, "Go down and say to the people, I was like Saul. Now I am Paul, for I see."
But I don't see.
The master repeated, "Go down and say," I pulled at his coattail. "For God's sake, Howard," I said, "go down."
Leave me alone.
The master commanded, "Go down." Poor Howard. Finally, he turned, and as he went down the stairs to face his ordeal, his back looked shrunken to me. The master leaned against the stair rail, his head thrown back, his eyes closed in anguished prayer. I sat on the top step, watching the master. This is like the agony in the garden, I thought. Christ's Gethsemane.
I was like Saul.
We both could hear Howard stumbling through his admission. He seemed to be dragging it out of himself.
Now I am Paul, for I see.
Nonetheless, when Howard came back upstairs, the master deluged him with love. Abdu'l-Baha ran forward to meet him, and as he ran, his arms open wide, he looked like a great flying bird. He enfolded Howard in a close embrace, kissed his face and neck, welcomed with ecstasy this broken man who, though bewildered, had obeyed. He had obeyed the center of the covenant.
Whatever Abdu'l-Baha wishes me to do, I will do. And whatever he wishes me not to do, I will not do.
For his obedience, Howard MacNutt was given the privilege of compiling all the master's talks in America. He published them in a volume called The Promulgation of Universal Peace. Abdu'l-Baha told him, "This service shall cause thee to acquire an effulgent face in the Abha kingdom, and shall make thee the object of praise and gratitude of the friends in the East and the West."
The master had also asked Julie to paint my portrait, I don't know why. I certainly wasn't very taken with the idea. In any case, she started painting me while she was still working on the portrait of the master. Now, this gave me an idea. You see, Abdu'l-Baha had expressed his desire that I travel to California. But I dreaded the thought of being separated from the master. I wanted to obey him, I really did. Just not right away. Did you tell them about the poison ivy? She's ignoring me. Julie doesn't like to encourage me. I'll tell you what happened. Abdu'l-Baha was preparing to leave New York for California, and he asked that I go ahead to make arrangements for his visit there. But I dreaded the thought of being separated from the master. I don't know what came over me, but at the Unity Feast in Teaneck, New Jersey, I deliberately walked through poison ivy. Back and forth, right through it, I trampled until my feet were thoroughly poisoned. Well, he can't send me to California now, can he? Julie, go to the master and say, how can Lua travel? Look at her feet.
I don't know why, but I did. I went and told Abdu'l-Baha what had happened, but he laughed out loud. Then he handed me an apple and a pomegranate. Take these to Lua, he said. Tell her to eat them, and she will be cured. Oh, precious Lua. Strange mixture of disobedience and obedience, and all for love. I think that's why the master didn't mind her disobedience. It was out of love, it was not out of rebelliousness. When it came to the covenant, Lua was always obedient. She taught May Maxwell the faith. She traveled alone to India. She pioneered to Egypt and died there. I shall never forget her. First seizing the apple and then the pomegranate and obediently chewing them all the way through, till not even a pomegranate seed was left. Obediently eating the cure, which was certain to send her to California. Later that afternoon, we were surprised by a visit from the master himself. He drew back the sheets and looked at Lua's feet. They were healed. Abdu'l-Baha burst out laughing. He knew Lua would always be firm in the covenant.
I had one more strategy. I had to try. As I said, Abdu'l-Baha had asked Julie to paint my portrait. But she'd only had one sitting with me when the master wanted to send me to California. Julie, please go to the master and say, if Lua's in California, how can I paint her? The portrait has already begun. But of course, when she went to the master, he only burst out laughing. As usual, he saw right through me. Needless to say, I obeyed and went to California. Instead, the master called Julie in to finish the portrait of him. It was June 19th, 1912. Now, earlier that day, the master had passed Julie and myself on the stairs. We both remarked that we felt a peculiar power in his step as he passed, as though some terrific force had possession of him. Oh, it was a force too strong to be caged in a body. Later, when Julie was putting the finishing touches on the portrait, the master closed his eyes and dozed off. Julie put down her paintbrush. What she saw was too sacred, too formidable to portray. And then, with a great flash like lightning, Abdu'l-Baha opened his eyes. The room seemed to rock like a ship in the storm with the power that was released. The master was blazing. 1,000 veils, concealing his station as the center of the covenant, had suddenly been burnt away. And we were exposed to the very flame itself.
Herald of the Covenant, he called her. Never will I forget that moment. The flashing eyes of Abdu'l-Baha, the reverberations of his voice, the power that still rocked the room. God of lightning and thunder, I thought. Then his voice boomed. I appoint you, Lua, herald of the covenant. And I am the covenant appointed by Baha'u'llah, he said of himself. And no one can refute his word. Go forth and proclaim, this is the covenant of God in your midst. A great joy seemed to lift Lua up. She looked like a winged angel.
Oh, recreate me, that I may do this work for thee.
The master then sent Lua downstairs to proclaim the covenant to the friends.
When the ocean of my presence hath ebbed, and the book of my revelation is ended, turn your faces toward him who hath branched from this ancient root.
The master soon followed Lua downstairs, and then spoke himself about his unique station as center of the covenant. It was then he declared New York City the city of the covenant. Then, to underscore this historic declaration, Abdu'l-Baha instructed that Baha'u'llah's Tablet of the Branch be immediately translated and read aloud to the entire gathering. The believers crowded into the room. Some even sat on the stairs, listening attentively to the words of Baha'u'llah.
There hath branched from the Sadrat al-Muntaha this sacred and glorious being, this branch of holiness. Well is it with him that hath sought his shelter and abideth beneath his shadow. Render thanks unto God, O people, for his appearance. For verily he is the most great favor unto you, the most perfect bounty upon you. And through him, every moldering bone is quickened. Whoso turneth toward him hath turned toward God. And whoso turneth away from him hath turned away from my beauty, hath repudiated my proof, and transgressed against me. He is the trust of God amongst you, his charge within you, his manifestation unto you. We have sent him down in the form of a human temple. Blessed and sanctified be God, who createth whatsoever he willeth, through his inviolable, his infallible